Welcome to the Kolbecast, episode 203. Thank you for joining us. Today we're joined by Kolbe instructors Sarah Foulkes and Grace Berg to take a deep dive into the classical composition courses. These courses help the students to develop their writing, reasoning, and rhetoric skills in the context of some great stories. I know my son and current student Ray loves the courses and his instructor, Mrs. Foulkes, and I think that you'll love hearing about the magic that happens in these classes. We hope that you'll enjoy the show.
Hi there, I'm Bonnie, Kolbe homeschooling mom of 4 lads and lasses, liturgical musician, popcorn, and podcast fanatic.
And this is Stephen, homeschooling father of 5 and chief homeschooling officer for Kolbe Academy.
Hi, Stephen. How's your day going?
Going well. My squirrel escaped once today, so I had to join the meeting here a little earlier. But so that a little extra excitement on a day.
Yes, that would be, yeah. Amazingly, we are approaching by the time this episode airs, in enrollment season for the upcoming school year. What would it be? 2024-25 somehow, which still is not. Anyway, I have not gotten my mind around that quite yet. Anyhow, so we are revisiting one of the forms of the Kolbecast that we haven't done in a while, and that's a deep dive into an area of the Kolbe curriculum. Today's topic is classical composition. We are visiting with Mrs. Sarah Foulkes and Mrs. Grace Berg. Welcome, ladies, to the Kolbecast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here. I love talking about classical comp, so I was really happy to be invited.
I so enjoyed our conversation the first time, and I'm really glad that you agreed to come back and visit with us again. Hi, Grace. It's really nice to meet you.
Hi, very nice to meet you too.
It's actually been a couple of years since we got to visit with Sarah for the first time on episode 81. And so, Sarah, what have you been up to since then, and how are you serving Kolbe now?
Yes. Well, I was teaching 4th grade, which I absolutely loved, but chose to take a step back to teach a little less and be a mama a little more. I just felt, on my heartstrings, the tug of motherhood, which I absolutely love, being at home and working on our homestead and all of those things. And so now I have a little almost 3-year-old running around and just the joys of getting to do everything with him and serve my family. And so now I just teach classical comp 1 and 2, and then get to be mom the rest of the time.
Wonderful, wonderful. So what is your typical age range in that classical comp 1 and 2?
Yes, so in classical comp 1 and 2, it's typically a 6th grader to an 8th grader that I would have. So kind of in that middle school range.
Okay. I'm going to ask you guys some questions about middle schoolers here, but first I want to get to know Grace a bit. Welcome to the Kolbecast, Grace. I'm very glad that you're joining us today. Would you tell us a bit about yourself and your background and your Kolbe connection?
Hi, my name is Grace. This year I've taught 5th grade humanities and classical composition 3 and 4. Last year was my first year at Kolbe, and I started off by teaching literature 6, classical comp 1 and 2, and classical comp 3 and 4. This is my first time teaching in a school setting, although before I came to Kolbe, I taught religious ed and confirmation for many years. That's how I discovered my passion for teaching and my passion for teaching the faith, and I've loved my time here at Kolbe.
Did I read that you were homeschooled yourself?
Yeah.
Will you tell us a bit about that?
So I was homeschooled from kindergarten until I graduated high school. And for the first 3 years, my mom designed her own curriculum. And after that, she put us into an online school similar to Kolbe Academy, except for it wasn't Catholic. So I grew up going to weekly live classes with the teacher and submitting assignments on a learning management platform very similar to Schoology. And then I went off to college, and partway through college, COVID hit. So then I was a virtual learner once again. So I've had many years
That's familiar.
of virtual learning, yes.
Okay. What was your favorite part about being homeschooled or doing it the way you did?
I think looking back, my favorite part was the relationship that I developed with my siblings and my parents. Everyone has has rocky relationships with their siblings at some point in their lives, but I've been so blessed to consistently refer to my siblings, not just as siblings, but good friends. And now that all of us are adults, we're very close, and all of our childhood memories, all the best ones, are of us doing things together. So it was such a blessing to get to be that close and to really grow up with my siblings.
Classical composition is maybe unfamiliar to many of our listeners. Hopefully, by the end of this, we'll have some more enthusiasts among us, because I have a little bit of experience working through some of the levels on the homeschooling side of things. A couple of, well, let's see, 3 of my kids have done at least some of the initial levels of classical composition, and one of them went through level 6, I think, and we can talk. I'll say more about that as we go along. So Sarah, before I get ahead of myself, as is my inclination, tell us a bit about classical composition. What's it look like? Kind of how does it work?
Yes. So classical composition is a curriculum which seeks to educate students to think logically and to develop their rhetorical skills, not only in their writing, but also for the intention of them being good speakers. And actually, even in my own teaching, the act of speaking and narrating and doing some of these exercises, not just written down, but also aloud, is really important. And classical composition is based on the progymnasmatas, which are before exercises or exercises that come before to help develop a student's mind in this manner so that they can be really strong, good, and confident writers.
Okay, I love that, the presentation of it. So Grace, talk to me about your introduction to classical composition. How was that?
My introduction to classical composition was really through Kolbe. The textbook was one that I had seen before on friends' shelves, and I had heard of it. I heard a lot of people, a lot of friends I had that graduated from Thomas Aquinas College talk about that was their foundation, and that's how they got into writing. So I had heard of it, but I was not very familiar with it until I was hired at Kolbe Academy. And then I had one summer to teach myself the material well and learn it well enough that I could teach it to other people. But it felt very familiar. It was principles that uh, I knew from my past teaching experience, or things that I had learned were helpful in college, things that I had noticed that kids struggled with. This curriculum was addressing.
So classical comp 3 and 4, are that also middle school, or do you have some high schoolers in there?
It's also middle school. It's 6th to 8th grade, and normally you take it after classical comp 1 and 2. So last year when I taught it, it was all 7th and 8th graders. This year I have 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, because the 5th graders have been doing a little bit of classical comp 1 and 2 in their first semester. So some parents have signed their 6th graders up for it.
Okay. And since you're both working with middle schoolers now, it's been a while since we did an episode on middle school, but I think it was well received. Do you have any thoughts about working with middle schoolers, things that you enjoy about them, encouragement that you would have for families with middle schoolers, things along those lines?
I feel like middle school is kind of the forgotten age. In elementary school, it's very common for parents to be incredibly involved. They're holding their child's hand. Once the kids get to high school, they're on their own and independent, and the parents get to see the fruits of their labors. But middle school is an awkward transition stage where there's some handholding and some independence. And because of that, it's not as picturesque as elementary or high school. We don't romanticize middle school. If you ask many people will tell you that they had negative middle school experiences. That's when, bullying would come into play, or all the awkwardness of being at that age. But I think it is one of the most fun ages to teach. You have a lot of kids who have not yet left the childhood stage and are coming into middle school bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with hopes and dreams and a childlike wonder, and you get to watch them transition into maturity. You get to watch them hopefully keep that childlike wonder, but watch them shed some of the less desirable habits of childhood as they get ready to go into high school. So my middle schoolers, they are smart and they are funny and they are witty. Many of them are wise beyond their years. It's really a joy and a privilege to get to teach these middle schoolers.
Hmm. What do you think, Sarah?
I would agree. The middle schoolers, they are witty and they are very funny. They like to be funny. They like to know that they're funny too, which is um it's such a joy. But the other thing I would say about the middle schoolers, it's this wonderful opportunity, kind of like Grace said, that they're moving out of this childlike stage. You can begin to have these conversations. Even thinking about one of the narratives we just did, um, about a man's clothes and how these clothes got him invited to a party. And he then tells his clothes at the end, eat because you were invited. And they thought this was the funniest thing. But it also led us into this deep conversation of what does it mean to make judgments? Can our judgments be something that can inform our decisions, that can actually be good for us to make? Can they hinder us from getting to know someone? So you get to really take these very simple stories that, maybe we're just maybe they've heard before, maybe they even haven't, but seems like a childlike story, and then really open up this new understanding for them to really dive into what is this little narrative or this little fable? What is this really showing me? What can I now, as a middle schooler, like you're saying, shedding my elementary um, habits and whatnot, what can I learn from these things? And it's really wonderful to kind of see them grow. And yes, some of them go through those awkward phases. But I will say that classical comp does this really wonderful thing of forcing the student to narrate aloud. We do a lot of things aloud in class, and through, I think, some of the humor of the stories and just the enjoyment and again, the safety of the stories really allows them, uh, I think, to feel less embarrassed in front of their classmates. I know that at that middle school age, you can feel awkward and not really want to share. And I think the comfort of classical comp and that structure that is in there allows them to do that more freely. I had students actually read aloud some of their rewrites, and I had a list of 10 volunteers up first, and I was honestly really surprised to see that many pop up because, they're a little embarrassed. Do I really have to read this? And once they have one reading, then the rest are like, oh yeah, me too. I want to read mine. So
Yeah.
I think, yeah, I agree though, Grace. It is a bit of a forgotten time. And I think parents have to remember how to get that middle schooler on their side, right? Like when you do that with an elementary student, the student really wants to please you. So you're trying to get them along in that way. And a middle schooler, as they begin to shed that elementary element or that childish sort of element of themselves, they are really moving into this place where they want you to reason with them more. They don't want you to just think that they're trying to please you all the time and give you what they want out of their writing or out of their work. They really want to kind of break into their own a bit more, and you have to invite them into that thing.
Lots going on there. Yeah. So this episode's been in the works for a long time. It's been one on my list for a while. And along the way, as we've been kind of working on it here and there, I heard about you, Sarah, when you were teaching fourth graders, that you were using it at that time too. So will you say a bit about that and how and your experience on working with students of that age?
Hmm. Yes, I'll kind of back up. I first heard about classical composition right around the time that I was graduating from college. And I took my first teaching job in a brick and mortar school that was brand new, and they were bringing in this classical composition curriculum that I really didn't know very much about. So, kind of like Grace, I was sort of teaching myself as I was teaching these students, but found, like Grace was saying, a comfort, like a familiarity in it, that I was noticing it was helping these students with things that they were struggling with. When I thought about becoming a teacher, it is sort of a daunting task of, okay, how do I teach someone to write? Like, I know how to write, but how do I really break that down? And classical comp really wonderfully gave that structure for that. So that was sort of my introduction into classical composition, and I taught it at a couple of other schools that I was a part of, to fourth, fifth, and sixth graders, that age group. And then when I came to Kolbe, speaking with Nicole O'Connor, who is the director of online elementary, she and I really connected over classical composition because she taught it prior to taking that position. And we would always talk about our love of it, how wonderful it is for the students. And I kind of asked her, can I weave in some of our curriculum? Can I weave in taking a fable and having the students outline and just do various things? So I would kind of just bring that in small parts, or even in our literature assignments, I would maybe have them vary a sentence that I pulled from whatever literature book they were reading. Like if we were reading Homer, we would pull that out. So I would really just try to integrate it. And I know that they're moving towards really bringing that into that age group a little bit more. I don't know all the details of it, but I've heard that they're trying to do that more. And those fourth graders, it's very interesting. It's a little bit different than this middle school age when you're trying to bring that in. But the fourth graders, they like looking at the story. I think the outlining is a big step for them. It's much harder, I would say, for a fourth grader to try to outline one of those fables um, than for like a middle schooler. I had to do a lot more modeling for them. So imitation comes in there. I really had to guide them in how I was thinking when I was looking at the story, trying to divide it into parts. There's a lot more that you kind of have to do with them, I would say, at that age. And some of them will catch on very quickly and then actually be able to follow and figure out some of the patterns of these stories, how to divide them, how to rewrite them. But I have found in my experience at Kolbe and then also at a school prior, that fourth grade age, they can do that fable stage and really start to write some wonderful stories, some wonderful paraphrases at a very young age that maybe people wouldn't really expect that they would be able to do, particularly alongside reading something like we were reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in fourth grade. And so when they see a description of, a particular tree or the snow and how C.S. Lewis describes that, or the conversations that happen between the characters, and then they can look at their own writing and see, oh, wow, like how can I make my description sound like that? Because that made me feel like I was really there in the event, in the story that was happening. So it's really wonderfully enriching for those fourth graders, but they just definitely need a lot more guidance and a lot more modeling for you to do the steps with them to help them along.
Before we started recording, we were talking about the good experiences we've had, certainly in our family, and you, Mrs. Foulkes, as you have worked with lots of students over the years, would you say a bit about how it has gone for students who are maybe reluctant writers or struggling in the subject, and families starting out?
Yes, of course. So I guess to kind of back up and just explain even what the first, which there are multiple stages to the classical composition curriculum, but the first couple of stages, what they do for a student is they present them with a very familiar story, right? Whether it's a fable or some sort of narrative, something like the tortoise and the hare, something that they've seen before. And so I think one, it really puts the student at ease, knowing that they're going to do this writing activity about something that they've heard before, something that is rather familiar. Maybe they even grew up hearing, as a young child, hearing some of these stories, particularly in the fable stage, which is stage one. And it really gives the student, I think, a comfortable then environment to begin to explore writing, and not only just their own, but reading someone else's writing and being able to imitate particular skills or descriptions or whatever it may be. But they start with this fable or this story, and then they begin to analyze it. So they'll look for different elements in the story, like reversal, which is the point in which there's a dramatic shift in the story. So they begin to look for these patterns as they work through these lessons. They also learn to outline the story, which is wonderful for the students to not have just a blank page in front of them to think, oh, what do I have to write down? But to first look at a story and be able to divide something into parts. It really gives them that skill of analyzing and summarizing and dividing a story. And I think that really provides them with a foundation to look at their own thoughts before they have to write something down. And how do I divide this up? How do I, want to present and summarize this material to my reader? And so it really gives them a great structure that they're not just given a prompt and said to them, hey, now go write, put something on a page, and they go, I don't even know what to put down.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful for a reluctant writer because it gives them this safe environment, and really like a roadmap. I actually tell my students that when they make their outline, it's their roadmap, that they have to hit these points so they don't change and alter the meaning of the story in any way. They still want the fable or the narrative to be intact so that the point or the message still comes across. So that outline is like that roadmap. So they still hit all those points, but then they're given tools to expand the story or modify the story in different ways, which really develops their writing skills then. But again, within this safe confines of this outline, which gives them structure, which gives them guidance. And then you can have also a conversation then about, well, did this really belong in your story? When you add this, did this add to the meaning of your story? Did it detract from the meaning of your story or the message of your story? It also provides you then as a teacher or as a parent, a way to discuss with your child, with your student, how well did this really fit into the story? Let's go back to that outline. Let's look at the trajectory of the story. And when you added these extra items, the way in which you added it, did it serve that story well? Because they have that roadmap, they have that structure in place for them. So it's really wonderful for that reluctant writer to have that. They aren't scared by the blank page in front of them.
Yeah, that's certainly been a real benefit here when so we started working on it. I think my kids were around fourth, fifth grade when we started using classical composition, and some of them were very enthusiastic, journalers and writers, and we of course read a lot. So it was not like a totally foreign concept, but at the same time, I think having that set of expectations, in which I use that word with some hesitancy, expectation, but that structure there, which I think it was hugely comforting. Like, all right, I know what to do with this. It's not, fill up this blank page. Would you say a bit more about the idea of this imitation? This is kind of built on the idea of imitation. We have this piece of writing, and as part of learning the craft of writing, we're going to imitate someone else's writing, which I think might be a bit of a might cause folks to kind of stop for a second and be like, huh, why would we do that? So would you say a bit more about that?
Right. So I start off by saying, yes, it does seem to be a very modern mindset to think that to be a great writer, I just have to magically produce all of these wonderful things out of thin air.
Yeah.
And really, when we look at even history throughout writing or even great speeches, looking at wonderful orators or even artists, you see that they first learn by studying those of the past, right? You think about an artist would be sent to a museum to make master copies of whoever's piece is in the museum at the time, right? Making master copies, learning what skills and what that artist before them or what that writer before them has done to produce their great work. And so I think it really puts students, even within that historical context of, I'm going to study the great things that have come before me. I'm going to use them as my teaching, as my tools that I have before me. How did this other writer bring in this beautiful description or bring in these beautiful elements into their writing? Even in the back of, in the appendix, in the back of the classical composition workbooks, they give examples of figures of description that students can use as kind of like a guidepost for themselves. They can read an example of animographia, like a vivid description of the wind from Little House on the Prairie or from Lord of the Rings, to see another writer who has masterfully used this type of description in their own writing, to get an idea then of, well, how does that serve my writing? And so it really does this wonderful job of presenting the great writers who have come before and allowing students to imitate those things. And when we say, I guess I should define, when we say imitate, we don't mean just exactly copy, right? We mean look at how the person, the author, has used those things, how they serve well in the story, so that a writer of his own accord can begin to explore that. And by repetitively doing that, I would say as well, in the lessons in classical comp, they get that practice over and over. They get to try it and say, I didn't do a great job. This element didn't fit well in the story. Next time I'm going to try it again and see if I can weave it in so it sounds better. They get that practice. Go ahead.
I'm loving all of these things. The ability to write is just, for me, great. And because I was a public school product, I've said many times on this. So I never got that just intense, like, let's just focus on how to write. But especially as I look at our Kolbe students, and, you're going to get into high school and it's going to be write this paper, write this paper, write this paper. And so to kind of start to overcome that just apprehend, like, wait, I know I can build the outline. I know I can write this, to get that going. But then to have it, like you're saying, with the familiar, where it's like, oh, this is something, it's not like I have to learn this and then write about this new thing. So I'm juggling multiple things there. So you've got the familiarity, and the interest things. So interesting stories and interesting takes on them. So that wonder and sort of like, hey, this is fun, in addition to being work, and really preparing me to be a good writer and speaker. It just seems like a wonderful opportunity for those kids.
Yes. So the other thing I was thinking about imitation was in relation to the variations that the classical composition curriculum guides students through, that they look at a sentence, and then really when they're switching out synonyms for certain words in the sentence, they're really asked to imitate the sentence, is really what they're being asked to do. And so they can choose different synonyms to put in place, and then they really can discuss. I seek to do this with my students in class, is discuss, well, how did this alter the meaning of our sentence by using different words? How does that impact the meaning of the sentence on its own, then in relation to the whole story? Does it change the connotation of how a character acts or the way that they think? And so by imitating a particular sentence and then making slight changes to it, I think it also allows students to see the power in the words that they choose. By changing even just one word, sometimes can very dramatically change what your reader will take away from that sentence.
Yeah, and it dovetails so nicely with the other subjects we're working on in language arts, with vocabulary and things like that.
Yeah, and in a like classroom setting as well, you can see them, meaning the students, you can see them kind of correct each other. Someone will suggest one sentence or one synonym in the sentence, and then someone else will be like, well, does it really fit in there? What does that mean? And they begin to then do that to each other, where they're analyzing and thinking about then these words. And I mean, I'll say even just over the last semester and into this semester, I have seen the words that they have chosen really expand dramatically. And I encourage them to take some of the challenging words maybe in a story and go home and try to use those slip them in, see if anyone notices that you've used this word today. So I really try to encourage them to do that as well. And then I think they naturally begin to put it into their writing. And I think they're very excited and proud then when they find a way in which they can use this word that maybe they've heard, and then they are like, what? I'll never use that word. But then they do, and it's like the most amazing thing for them.
Yep. And more motivation. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I love that there's the analyzing that a little bit. I remember at one point teaching or working with students, and it seemed like so many of them got into the very verbose stage where they just wanted to use as many long words as possible. And you start reading it, and you think that word's close, but it doesn't mean what you think it
Right.
means. So it's nice that they're keeping each other in check there with that. But
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So we're at the outline point and these initial stages. Do you have examples that you can kind of illustrate what you've been explaining to us, and then what happens after that?
Yes. Okay. So a student will read, for example, in the fable stage, they will read a fable like the fox and the grapes, or the tortoise and the hare, and they will read that story and be able to look at the different elements of the story. They'll outline it, and then they'll work on varying about 3 or 4 sentences in the fable to help improve their vocabulary skills, and all of those things that we mentioned prior. And then they will take that outline, which again is their roadmap, and then they will rewrite the story in 2 ways. And so, first way typically is that they amplify the story or they expand it by adding figures of description. And so they have the wonderful task of getting to learn all of these fancy sounding words, as they like to say, like animagraphia and dendrographia, and mimesis and prosopographia, all different fancy words that are essentially descriptions that then they get to add into their story. So it may be a description of the wind or a tree or someone's face, or maybe even just a particular nation or a group of people. So again, a description that would then have them think about, if I'm going to describe a particular person as belonging to a group, what are the characteristics or qualities that are similar to those particular group of people? So it really gives them these wonderful tools. They're about 17 or 18 figures of description that then they can expand the story. And so a lesson will give them about 2 or 3 that they have to insert into their story. And again, it's meant to craftily insert them, not just plug them in wherever they can. So that's something we discuss a lot in classes. How can we weave these in? Where does it serve the story best? Sometimes talk about the different locations that a figure description could be, and its benefits or its drawbacks. And then just trying to balance it within a story so that you don't just put them all right at the beginning or all right at the end, and then it sounds, imbalanced and sort of out of place. So that's the first rewrite that they do. It's called a paraphrase. And in the narrative stage, which is the second stage, they also do something where they change the perspective of the story, where they get to write from a different character's point of view. And man, when I introduced this in second semester, it was like fireworks in our little Adobe classroom. They were like, "What? Wait, we get to write from either Ares or Adonis's or Aphrodite's point of view." It was like the best thing ever. I thought I had given them all of their Halloween candy right then. So they were so excited, and I could tell in their writing, they took that and they ran with it, really putting themselves in those characters' shoes, so to speak. And then the second paraphrase that they will do, so the second rewrite for a lesson, it's something else that will happen. They will either reduce the story down, so getting the students to condense something and write very succinctly. It might have them invert the story where they tell it backwards. When I introduce that, I always ask the students to try to tell their day backwards of what they did, starting with when they went to bed at night, all the way to when they got up in the morning, and doing it in a manner that's not just and then, or before that, before that. So it really forces them to think, how do you, in a not mundane manner, tell something backwards? How do you still make it interesting? And then the final way for the second paraphrase could be that they reorder it by starting in the middle. And they still have to include all the events that occurred in the story, but they start in the middle and have to tell it all the way through. So again, how do you weave in something that happened prior when you start in media res? It's really wonderful. It gives them a lot of skills to not only write, but again, when they're reading someone else's writing, they could be sitting and reading Narnia or whatever, and they can think to themselves, oh, this story was, this section of the story was told backwards, or they started in the middle and then they came back and told us what happened first. And it really gives them, again, not just the tools for them to do it, for them also to recognize it when they read it and they encounter it elsewhere.
There's so many things that are part of this program that are applicable in other areas as well. As you're describing the variations and the different ways of telling the story and the different perspectives, those are all elements of creativity that they can bring into it in a supported and a structured. It's like a fence, like you're in this yard, playground, but it's got a fence around it, so you can do various things on the playground within the context of that. So you have these elements that you can change up a bit, but it's all still contained somehow so that you're not just off in one area doing whatever. And I think that's part of one of the things that I like about it. It is just not just come up with this random piece of writing and go where, just land somewhere, who knows where, and and what have we learned there and how can we do that next time in some other context? I don't know. So that's probably a little bit of a tangent there, but that's one of the things that I have liked about it.
Bonnie, your playground story always makes me think of like when they did that sort of experiment or whatever with fences around school playgrounds, and they observed that when the fence was up, the kids expanded to the entire playground, but when there's no fence, they stick close to the building.
Mm-hmm.
So probably it's true with classical comp. It gives them a fence, but then they get to play in the whole playground, not just stay closer.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I've never heard that before, but I actually really love that, Stephen. I never heard that. I was actually thinking of it more from a standpoint, a broader commentary on, I would say, the philosophy of teaching, that we have to give our students a little something and then just let them run with it, let them go, versus when we put a fence up, it's not intended to be this ominous limiting thing, but rather to show them some boundaries that I think then really actually help them flourish. I think of it akin to as well, right? When God puts in place for us boundaries, because he knows that that's what is good for us. And I think we as teachers do that too, right? We want to give our students an area in which to flourish. We don't want to give them too many things. We don't want to overwhelm them. We want to give them what is suited for them at their age, at that time, at their development. And so those boundaries, those limits, that fence is actually really wonderful for their flourishing and their growth.
I agree. I'm with you there. I like that this is one of those areas where we can introduce it in fourth grade, we can introduce it in middle school, and even upper middle school. There are elements that will be beneficial to students along the way wherever they are when it's first introduced. That also lends itself to working well in a homeschooling family when we have multiple kids. We're trying to the first word that comes to me is batch a subject, but like do have everybody doing the same subject at the same time. That certainly worked well for us here in our household when we had a couple of kids, different ages, close in age, but doing this same topic. And that helped me as the homeschooling parent to manage that better than I would otherwise if it were divided, each of them doing their own thing, right? So I think it has a lot of benefits to the homeschooling families to in those areas, and also as another option for reluctant writers, struggling writers, that has come up along the way too. Sarah, you've mentioned along the way, and as we've been kind of chatting, preparing this episode, how well it works for some of your boy students. Will you say a bit about how it's worked well for boys and thoughts there? Because I have some too, but I want to hear yours.
Yes, of course. So in my experience teaching classical comp, I would say it definitely benefits all students, but I've noticed particularly it tends to benefit boys in a way that I've honestly been surprised that boys even verbalize to you at a certain point as you go through the lessons. Um, I can actually think of an experience before coming to Kolbe that I was taking a group of sixth graders, and they had fallen a little bit behind in their writing, and we were using classical comp. And in a year, we were moving them through the fable and the narrative stage. And as we were moving into the narrative stage in the second half of the year, I had one of my students stop and say, you know, Mrs. Foulkes, I really don't know why, but this writing, it just feels so much easier. I feel like I know what I'm doing. And that was just sort of like a light bulb for me that, wow, what is it about this that boys really do love and thrive with classical composition? Because I had heard this before, listening to Memoria Press even just talk about this curriculum. They mentioned that boys particularly do well with it. And I really do believe it's because it has that structure and has that guidance for them. I think girls are much more naturally disposed to, if you open sort of up the floor for them, they will run away with telling you all of these things, and they would be happy to write more for you and talk more. And boys are not always, I would say, as inclined. Um, and I think it really gives them that structure. It gives them the guidance that they need to be able to write a story and feel like they know, I think, where they're going, even in their writing, rather than just looking at a blank page. They have uh, this guidance for themselves. And I would say also one of the other things that brought this to light for me in my own experience was just watching uh, how I maybe would interact with um, my son or with a student versus maybe how a male figure would. And when you watch like a male figure speak to another boy, there's just something about it, right? That's like, I'm giving you the freedom to do these things, but it's within these confines, right? I am even thinking about my husband when they're doing things outside with the tractor, the lawnmower, some tool oriented thing. It's, you know, my husband tells my son, okay, this is what we're doing, and it stays within these confines. But within those confines, you have the ability to do these things. And I think it speaks so wonderfully to boys and how they learn. So I have found it's really wonderful for them and really enriching.
Yeah, and that's huge for their buy-in. Like their even just their willingness to approach it and to complete it. You can kind of circumvent some frustration. Not all, of course. I mean, the stories and the source material appeals to them in many contexts, and they there's just it just goes better in my experience. But Grace, have you seen that also?
Definitely. But I've also noticed that classical composition seems to resonate with boys. And I think part of that, like Sarah said, is the amount of guided freedom that they have. We're giving them a toolbox and saying, go and build something. So they don't have to worry as much about getting lost in the instructions, if that makes sense. Like it's giving them a chance to explore, but explore within that fence, to go back to that metaphor that we were talking about. Um, I see it a lot in classical 3 and 4 that something will just like light up in the boys' eyes the first time they get a chance to argue. Because so often students are told, don't argue with the teacher, or if this is what the text says, this is what the text says, and that's it. Whatever your own opinions are, that's great, but unless it's stated in the text, there's nothing we can do with that information. So once the boys get into classical comp 3 and 4 and they're told, argue, take this narrative, pick it apart, tell me why it's wrong, tell me why it's bad, tell me why it could be better, or now argue the opposite. Defend, play devil's advocate, defend this, tell me why it is brilliant. Young boys, they want to fight, and not the disordered type of fighting, although sometimes boys do want to do that disorder type of fighting of like violence and hurt, but they want to defend. They are built to defend and attack, and when properly ordered, it is a wonderful and beautiful thing. And classical composition gives them a place to defend and attack with not their fists, but with their minds. So I've seen it, take boys that are very normally shy and quiet and kind of reserved, and it brings out in them excitement and energy. I've had boys that are high energy and who are always getting into conflicts with other students, and in classical comp 3 and 4, something mellows them because now they have an outlet for how fast their brain is moving. They get to argue and go on an adventure within their writing. So I think classical composition is a wonderful program for everyone, but there is a special benefit for boys as they're learning how to become young men and then how to become adult men and serve, protect, and defend their communities.
Yeah, well, I'm betting that there are some listeners wondering how it fits with the whole slate of Kolbe courses.
But really, it's one of those subjects that fits in with everything if you not if you do it right, but if you plan ahead a little bit and work on it, then they coexist very nicely.
They really do.
Yeah, the integration with the other subjects and the subject matter, the sources are just interesting. It's interesting, interesting people and fables and historical figures, scripture, animals, like all just the topic to think about. It's just interesting to think about. And I think that helps a lot too with the continued forward progress, or even just doing well at they have something interesting to think about and work on. So that's, yeah.
I also see how this course really helps kids who are in literature and English with essay writing. When the kids first come to classical comp 3 and 4, and I tell them every week from now on, you're going to write an 8-paragraph essay, the kids freak out. They are upset and they say, Mrs. Berg, you don't understand. It takes me 3 weeks to write a 5-paragraph essay. I can't write 8 paragraphs. And I tell them, okay, write this down on a piece of paper. And at the end of the year, pull out that piece of paper and you're going to laugh at yourself, because yes, you can. This classical composition, it's not writing the type of essay that you write in literature. It's not writing a book analysis. We're not, using in-text citations and making a citation page and all of that. It's a different way of thinking. It's teaching the kids to come to conclusions logically. We're developing their ideas. So even though we have thesis statements and topic sentences and concluding sentences, it's not as strict, it's not as limited as some of the academic writing that we do. And because of that, kids tend to go crazy. At the beginning of the semester, I normally, the minimum is 8 paragraphs, and I tell them, like, try to fill up at least a page. By the end of the semester, we have to spend a lot of time working on editing out, but it gives the kids the confidence to say, I can write a lot. I can write more than a paragraph. I can fill up multiple pages. And of course, we don't want to teach them to write to a page count or teach them to write to get to a specific word count. But for a kid to have the confidence to say, yes, I have enough in my brain that I can talk about this as long as I want, is fantastic. So I see it as a great benefit to children in their English and literature classes. My classical comp students tended to write much stronger essays than the kids who were not in classical comp and were learning only this one way to write an essay.
Yeah, it lends itself well to the expectation of the 5-paragraph essay, or that kind of writing that they're going to see more of in high school. And well, speaking, I guess our own experience, but yeah, it's less of a thing than it seems like. Well, they didn't learn to do a 5-paragraph essay. Well, yeah, they Any final thoughts you want to leave with our families as they're thinking about classical composition, whether they're working on it or they might?
I have a lot of students ask me, and parents too, well, why why should I take classical comp? Why should, because there's three different like classes they can take. They can take literature, or they can take grammar composition, or they can take classical comp. So parents are always asking, well, which one do I pick for my kids? And I tell them honestly, I am biased. So you might not want to ask me, but my thoughts are that it depends what your kids want to study. If you are staying with Kolbe, if you're staying in a classical education setting, if you're hoping that your kids are going to go to Christendom or Thomas Aquinas College or University of Dallas, these Catholic colleges, which are not using academics for the sake of academia, but actually learning how to form the mind, classical composition is a fantastic way to introduce your kids to this higher level of thinking. Because it's teaching them not to write to get a good grade or to please a teacher or to make this format or to, write 5 paragraphs and say nothing at all. It teaches them to come up with an idea and defend that idea. It teaches them to pick apart a narrative and break it down to its most fundamental levels. It forces them to think deeply, and to confront and challenge their own thoughts and preconceptions of what the world is like and what other people think. So, it's not for everyone. Some kids, this is not where they want to be, and that's fine. Having this very formulaic approach and this very repetitive approach to writing doesn't work for all kids, which is totally fine. But I think that it's a great foundation for a lot of students, especially students who want to continue on in classical education.
Yeah, I would just second what Grace is saying. And then I guess I would say for any parent deciding, whether this is a good fit for their child or not, is really thinking about, like Grace said, that this is intended to form the mind of your child, of your student. And one key point when I'll say in the stage 1 and 2, fable and narrative, we're looking at the truth of the story. Part of what the students have to do is discover the truth of the story. So when they're thinking about their writing, it's not just to put something on a page. We're really trying to teach them to write in a way that they are speaking to and sort of persuading towards truth with whatever it is that they're writing. Like in the stages that I'm teaching fable and narrative, it's through a story, right? And the imaginative tools that go with that, with what Grace was talking about in 3 and 4, it's a bit different, right? It's appealing a little bit more to the logic side. She talks about arguing and being able to refute something, bringing in examples that support. So you're really trying to guide your student to write and then eventually speak in a way that they are, that truth is that end goal, conveying the truth of some particular thing through their writing. So I would just encourage parents and teachers to keep that in mind when they, are using classical comp to form their students, that it's with that in mind.
So Kolbe offers the online classes levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then course plan. They also offer course plans for those levels for homeschool, traditional homeschool, as we call it. But then in addition to that, Kolbe has course plans for the next few levels beyond that. And as we've been discussing, if you choose to go even beyond that, it's by that point, you'll know how it goes very well, and you can carry on. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of the classical comp. That really worked out well for us. I appreciate Mrs. Muth suggesting that to us, and glad we gave it a shot. It's something to discuss with Kolbe advisors as families are planning their next year's courses and whatever, and how to make that work if they want to give that a go. So, all right. So, Sarah, it's been wonderful seeing you again, visiting with you. Let's not let 2 years go by again before you come back and visit with us. And Grace, it's been lovely meeting you, and I look forward to the next time I get to visit with you. Thank you both so much for coming to visit with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bonnie.
Subscribe to the Kolbecast on your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss an episode. And let us know how we're doing by leaving a rating or a review. And as always, feel free to email us at podcast@kolbe.org.
Mary, our Mother, pray for us. St. Maximilian Kolbe, St. Ignatius of Loyola, holy saints and angels, pray for us. Ad maiorem Dei gloriam.